Today, I'm joined by Michael Tracey. Michael is a journalist, a political commentator, and the owner-operator of a very successful Substack, the mtracy.substack.com, that you should all visit. Welcome, Michael.
Well, don't just visit the Substack. If you want to enhance the success, you must subscribe. I mean, that should be clarified. And also, my last name is spelled with an E. That's also extremely important because throughout my life, I've been shamefully confused with different Traceys who do not have an E in their surname. And that sometimes confuses people as to my ethnic background. Tracey is an Irish surname, whereas people who are Jewish often have the surname Tracey without an E. And actually, I enjoy and appreciate and welcome being confused as a Jew because it actually makes people think I'm more impressive than I really am. But at the same time, if you want to have an accurate understanding of my lineage and also of how my name is spelled, you should recognize that there's an E in there.
Yes, indeed, I shall. In the show notes will reflect this change. I just realized I was checking the URL, and it's I did misspell your name in this podcast recording software. So yes, my bad.
I forgive you.
Thank you.
I'm giving you 3 strikes for this podcast, and you're at God. 1 strike. So,
oh God,
3, I log off and denounce you on Twitter.
I've been denounced so much lately for so many reasons. I feel like I'm at that ripeness of account where I'm interesting enough to be known outside of my mutuals, so that people have to have a position regarding me. So what's your position on the Kashuta question? You know, is she based or is she cringe? A lot of people said that I'm cringed. Yes, the AQ. Yeah, it's a big problem now. And I know you've been getting a lot of I don't know. Interesting. I don't know. Is it attacks? Is all of this affecting you in any way? Do you take it to heart that people are against you continuously every day?
Well, it's not a new thing. When it first started happening at scale, I would be lying if I didn't acknowledge that it had some impact psychologically, because when you have just thousands of people united in condemnation of you and telling you that you're a horrible individual and you should die and that nothing you ever do in life will be worth anything. I mean, I think you have to be sort of psychologically deranged if that doesn't have some influence on you. But over time, you build up a sort of natural immunity to those attacks where, yeah, I mean, they still have an effect to some extent, but not in any way that's debilitating, at least for me. And in fact, some of the attacks strengthen my resolve because a lot of them come from people who I find to be just obnoxious and also corrupt. So if I'm being attacked by obnoxious, corrupt people, then that's not automatically a sign that I'm doing something right, but it's a correlation that I might be on roughly the right trajectory. So I've been attacked a lot in recent days and weeks by people who, if you just do like 3 additional clicks on their profile info, you discover that they're affiliated with one of these think tanks in the US or the UK that are funded just outright by the weapons manufacturing industry or by Google or Microsoft, or even sometimes by the government, US government directly, like the State Department or even the Pentagon. Like there was this woman yesterday who was calling me a shill for Putin, even though I've never actually said a positive word about Putin ever. But that doesn't matter. That's not going to insulate you from any of these critiques, as I've found a long time ago. Actually, during Russiagate, really was when I became most acquainted with this mode of attack. But this woman calls me a shill, right? And I'm going to pull up her name because it's one of these despite having tried to immerse myself in kind of Slavic pronunciation recently, I'm not that great at it, so I have to kind of take out a visual aid and make sure that I'm reading it properly, or else I'll screw it up. But this woman's name is Olga Lotman. All right, actually, that name's not that hard, but she calls me a shill, right? Shill for Putin's genocide regime. Like I'm a genocide denier, even though I've never said anything remotely like that. And then, sure enough, you look at who this person is. And I'm not even necessarily singling this person out. She's just representative of a trend in terms of who's coming out of the woodworks to chastise me in the most extreme terms. And she's a fellow at this think tank. First of all, fellow. I mean, I guess there's no female version of that, like lady, senior lady at the think tank rather than senior fellow. Anyway, Center for European Policy Analysis. Wow, sounds really benign and almost unremarkable, right? Well, interestingly enough, it's based in Washington, D.C., where they're analyzing European policy. And then you just click onto their website. I mean, this is not like intrepid journalism that I'm doing. It's just like basic due diligence, right? You just click on their website, and it's almost incredible how brazen they are and just flat out admitting who the organization is funded by. I mean, they don't even try to conceal it because it's just so normal, especially in D.C. and to a large extent London. I'm not as familiar with other capitals, but it's the most pronounced and just unmitigated in its transparency in DC in particular, but also London, where I am now. And look at who's funding this SEPA groups, CEPA. Look it up for yourself. You have the National Endowment for Democracy, U.S. State Department, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, Government of Estonia, Google, Microsoft. I mean, it's like a rogues gallery of all the interests that if you think you were funded by, then you ought to be called a shill. And she's going around calling me a shill, even though I've never taken needless to say, I've never taken a dime from Russia, nor would I've never had any affiliation at all with Russia. But these people who are actually paid functionaries of some of the most powerful corporations and governments in the world, including corporations that have the most, I think, sinister profit motive, meaning to foster violent conflict around the world so they can sell arms like Lockheed Martin and General Dynamics. They're funded by these interests, and yet they have enough gumption to call others a shill. And so, if I'm attacked by people who are as deluded as that, or just as kind of mired in a frenzied mindset as that, then no, I'm not going to take that as some sort of indictment of me personally. I mean, I don't know if you found this in your notoriety online, but often what people will do is frame their criticism of you in deeply personal terms, like they know somehow viscerally that you're just a bad person inside, like they can access the deepest recesses of your brain and ascertain that you have some sort of ill intent and you're just a bad person. Criticisms along those lines, again, it's impossible to take seriously because I've never met these people. I mean, I would take it seriously if somebody in my personal life, rendered such a charge against, because they at least have some basis to make a claim about my kind of interior nature. But people who have substantive qualms with me or qualms about my political views or journalistic output or whatever, and then try to formulate that as some sort of searing personal indictment, they don't have any basis to do so. So that's also a line of criticism that I think it's would be asinine to take to heart. On the other hand, and I just did this a couple of days ago, I have this. I'm on this app, Callin. I don't know if you're on that or you're familiar with it, but it's sort of like an interactive podcast type app where you can either talk yourself or have a guest or something. It's reminiscent of Clubhouse when that was popular, and I don't know. I guess that was obliterated into the tech graveyard or something. But it's basically an interactive podcast where you can have callers and people can comment or ask questions or whatever. It's it's a pretty good premise for an app. And just a few days ago, I had somebody on who was a journalist or a writer who had attacked me, editor of this journal called Liberal Currents. So basically, it's a journal to exposit what they believe to be the most formidable version of mainstream kind of liberal democratic values. And this guy attacked me. And I said, look, and I often make this offer to critics, right? I said, look, if you want, I'm happy to engage on the substance of this. If you have a legitimate criticism of me, I will happily respond, and we can hopefully maybe carry out a fruitful dialogue. And to this guy's credit, his name is Adam Gurry. He accepted, and we spent, an hour and a half talking about it. So I'm kind of just by nature open to criticism. I actually appreciate criticism because it sharpens your focus, right? It holds you to account, makes you kind of ensure that your arguments are sound or logically solid, that you're not making any mistakes factually or argumentatively. So a robust criticism is actually good. And when it's on the substance, I not only will entertain it, but actively invite it. But the personal stuff, which is obviously, what a lot of people on the internet are interested in doing, that's not really worth letting get to you. Although I acknowledge that in order to kind of shield yourself from letting it get to you, you have to have some abnormal psychological characteristics that I can't really recommend to be adopted on a population-wide level, because most people, I think, would be reasonable to have an adverse reaction to thousands of strangers flooding them to denounce them as a horrible embodiment of evil.
Okay. No, I agree with you. It's it is a strange feeling to be mobbed by. I mean, mobbed. I think mob probably is the best verb to describe the action of tens and then hundreds and then thousands of people speaking about some personal characteristic of yours. But it does feel like now with Russia and Ukraine, at least for me, because I've tried to be nuanced in a situation where you shouldn't be nuanced, where nuance is a death sentence for you if you're in the public eye and you want to be like, okay, why exactly is this happening? You're not starting every sentence with a denouncing Putin as the embodiment of Satan on earth, and it kind of brought some very strange people out of the woodwork. Like it's just people who just like in my mentions, saying stuff like, oh, I like the same stuff over and over again, and then respawning again to tell me that they want my son to watch me be gang raped by Russian soldiers and things like that. And I'm like, okay.
That's a little uncharitable.
Okay, interesting.
No, and I think that's maybe taking things a bit too far.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a handful of unhinged individuals, but it does feel like this particular version of the current thing is inflamed people more than other things. I don't know how it feels for you. Yeah. Obviously, you've taken actual, reported on the situation. You actually went to the border. You went to Poland. Like, what was the atmosphere like there?
Well, yeah, just on the point of the intensity of online vitriol at the moment. Yeah, since the invasion was launched, at least from my standpoint, the kind of fervor and persistence of the online attacks and trolling surpassed anything that I had experienced before. I mean, there have been times where it was bad, like if you took any kind of countervailing view during the 2020 riots/protests, there would be these recurrent Trump controversies where you could kind of touch a nerve and you'd get a lot of heated pushback. And there are even times where like the right wing does it. If you, like, I remember the first time I really was quote unquote swarm was in 2016 when I did. It was an episode where there were these left-wing protesters who had gone to a Trump rally and protested. It was one of the first kind of signs of some sort of newfound Antifa type movement. And they had, I think, thrown a tomato or some sort of fruit at some Trump supporter, right? And it was sort of like a mini controversy. And I put out what I tried to make clear was almost like a thought experiment to kind of clarify a certain principle that was at stake, which is that, my point was that if these opponents of Trump actually believe what they're saying and to believe the depictions of him that they're promulgating, in that they genuinely are of the conviction that Trump is this world historic fascist menace on the order of a Hitler 2.0, and he's on the precipice potentially of taking the reins of state in the most powerful country in world history, then I would say, if that is your true belief, then there are certain potential actions that could follow from that would be reminiscent of a genuine resistance, right? Like if I've genuinely thought that of a leader of the U.S., then I think it would be more incumbent on me to take certain actions in concert with that belief. And yet, by and large, they weren't doing that. So I was actually sketching out this like formulation to show that they really did not believe, by and large, these people who making the most inflammatory and extreme claims about the nature of Trump really didn't believe their own rhetoric because they weren't altering their own behavior in such a way as would reflect if they held this conviction, right? But there was a right-wing tsunami where of trolls where they took what I was saying literally, in that, I was somehow endorsing violence on Trump supporters, which I wasn't. So, I mean, it's been across the spectrum. I think most often now it's directed at me by left liberals and such. And it's been recurrent throughout the years. And as like one's online following grows, the potential that one is going to get embroiled in one of these controversies also increases. But since the invasion on February 24th, it's definitely the most intense and persistent and unsort of shakeable trolling / online attacks. And a lot of it seems probably organic to me. I mean, I think people are genuinely in a sort of war fervor that they can only really enter if there is a war. I mean, war has some unique kind of enlivening qualities about it that sort of heightens the focus people have on current events. And so some of it's organic. Some of it strikes me as a bit dubious, but it's hard to parse. So yeah, I would say that this has definitely been the most intense period for me in terms of the online wrath that I'm personally receiving, but it's manageable. In terms of the experiences I had on the ground in Poland, it was kind of interesting. There's not there's always an interesting dichotomy between the intensity of the frenzy online versus how kind of ordinary people are negotiating their feelings about different sorts of news events. The most common, I would kind of casually go around and survey ordinary Poles when I could about what their thoughts were on the war. What do they think the Polish government's response should be? What, if any, action do they think that NATO or the U.S. should take militarily, et cetera? And probably the most common response that I got from Poles, especially younger Poles, when sort of I queried them on the subject, was, I don't even want to think about it. Like they just wanted to push it out of their minds because they've been told that there's this, especially by older Polish people, they've been told that there's this potential that, if Putin is allowed to prevail in Ukraine, that he's going to move into different countries and potentially even invade Poland. It's this sort of neo-domino theory thing that's operative, and I can't discount it fully. I mean, I don't know what Putin's full designs are. I don't really see a whole lot of evidence that he would necessarily be intent on invading Poland, but you can't really rule anything out definitively at this point because a lot of people didn't really anticipate a full-scale invasion of Ukraine either. So I've tried to be humble in allowing for different potentialities. At the same time, though, there was a pretty discernible undercurrent of paranoia running through a lot of the Poles that I spoke to, especially older Poles, but amongst the younger ones, it was almost not quite apathy, but a reticence to even be bothered to formulate a full thought about the situation because they would rather just compartmentalize and not really think about it, which is sort of different from the tenor of the discussion online, where everybody has to have the most incendiary barb at the ready to express their opinion on this or that latest development. I did something different in attempting to cover this conflict, and I think that sort of explains a lot of the backlash that I've received or the criticism, which is that I didn't think I could add that much by going physically into Ukraine and covering the aftermath of bombings or, doing the kind of more quintessential war reporting stuff. For one thing, just an individual, and I don't have this institutional backing where stuff can be arranged for me by like a corporate media network and fixers can be obtained and translation services provided and security and financial stuff can be handled. So I was sort of on my own. So I thought, what I could potentially do that might be more fruitful and might actually address what I perceived to be a gap in the coverage was to get a better sense of the nature of U.S. policy in particular, namely the proxy war that it's waging with Poland as the kind of staging area, right? And so, to do that, I talked to U.S. military personnel where I could, talk to Department of Defense civilians who are now stationed in Poland. I mean, there are more U.S. Military personnel in Poland than there have been in decades. And a lot of them are concentrated right in this border area of with Ukraine. And, so whenever you have this kind of concentration of new military activity also flooding into that area are going to be slightly, let's say, dubious characters. So I was able to talk to, guys bragging about how they supposedly have all these special forces contacts and are utilizing their direct line to the Ukrainian general staff, of the military, and are somehow organizing shipments of cargo into Ukraine and have this deep familiarity with the supply lines running in and out of Poland and Ukraine, and are also very familiar with Department of Defense procurement processes, so like what defense contractors actually do when they're given these contracts, and they have to make bids and whatnot. So I heard this guy bragging about it, right? And then he wouldn't give me his name, and he just claimed that he was doing this humanitarian aid mission, which I guess required intense daily contact with the Ukrainian military command. So you're sort of surrounded by these people, and there is sort of a tenor of ambiguity or uncertainty amongst just the ordinary people, especially when you talk to Ukrainian. Especially women who had been displaced and had fled the war and had come to Poland. But it's interesting because, like, even though when I talk to these displaced women, I don't really care for the term refugee. I don't know why exactly. I'm not making light of their situation, and clearly they went through a harrowing experience, and many of them spent days, fleeing a war zone with their babies and so on. And that's not any to be taken lightly. But I almost think, I don't know if you have any thought on this, but I've been struck when I've been writing about this that to use the word refugee kind of seems to reduce their entire life experience into this one kind of category of victimization. And a lot of the women who I spoke to, and they're overwhelmingly women who have left the country, they didn't seem like they want to be known fully as refugees. Like they want to self-identify as a refugee. Like it's just one episode in their lives that they're trying to move beyond now. And make the best of. So I don't know. I just have a sort of a reticence to use that term, but that's sort of a side issue. The point is that they, even though a lot of them, and I wrote a Substack on this, even though almost all of them that I spoke to, when pressed, did want like the U.S. to impose a no-fly zone, although they didn't really have much cognizance that the U.S. would have to do this militarily or what the ramifications could be in terms of potentially sparking a wider war. Even though they did favor that by and large, when pressed, they were kind of calm about it. There wasn't this sort of frenzy that you see reflected online. And maybe that's just the nature of like this bifurcated reality that we all live in. But I am sort of struck by how much more sensible people are when you talk to them in person, even those who were the most directly impacted, meaning they had to literally uproot their lives and pack frantically their belongings and flee the country that they live in with their small children in tow. Even that, they seemed much more rational and easy to talk to than a lot of the people that you would encounter on Twitter. So what to make of that, not sure, but it's sort of an interesting dichotomy that I seem to routinely pick up on.
Yeah, it does seem like the way events play out online, trickles into reality. There's kind of a really strengthening feedback loop between what's going on and how things are presented and how alliances are formed and tribes form online as well. And it also seems to be like we're now have entered an era online where there's permanent hysteria. And it started, inklings of this started kind of around 9/11, where the internet still wasn't what it is today. And then it accelerated with the migrant crisis, Arab Spring, Then George Floyd was huge. That was a huge, moving of the discourse onto the internet and factions, and everything kind of reached a fever pitch with COVID. And now the next thing now is Ukraine. And it feels like for the last how many years, it's been just this permanent state of emergency, which obviously a lot of people have benefited from. I'm not saying that, this was seeded from the top, or there's nefarious forces, but this narrative wave that everyone's involved in, especially the elites of the world, does confer powers to some people, and you could see how things are been taken over by some, and they're riding this wave and they're promoting certain things. So I don't know. It seems to me like it wouldn't surprise me if next year by this time we would have a similarly incredible crisis that grips the world that has nothing to do with Ukraine or Russia. It's going to be either a different conflict, a pandemic, a crisis of a certain minority fighting against another minority. Like this seems to be like this. This is a permanent now. This is what we're going to have to deal with, and the states around the world will have more and more powers because obviously these are states of emergency. We have to act on whatever is the current thing.
Yeah. It's funny. I was just rereading something related to January 6th for an ancillary reason. And I was reminded that on January 6th, 2021, CNN had its highest ratings ever of all time. So when you talk about people standing to benefit or certain factions having a motive to perpetuate this seemingly endless state of emergency, in many cases, it's absolutely explicit and direct. I mean, CNN lives for these so-called emergency situations that require everyone to dutifully tune in to their coverage and follow the latest kind of solemn intonations of Wolf Blitzer. And that's reflected in their rhetoric, meaning they have every incentive to employ rhetoric in their coverage that inflates rather than deflates the alleged severity of the threat at hand. So Jake Tapper, actually also as a CNN anchor, did something incredible in, I think, about maybe a week or so after the invasion was launched, which is he did this whole editorial. I mean, supposedly he's this neutral journalist with no partisan inclinations or no ideological views at all. He's just keeping everyone honest, right? Which, I mean, I think it has now long been exposed to be a total joke. I mean, very few people fall for that any longer. But Jake Tapper sort of had a different reputation where, he was sort of known for holding Democrats accountable as well, and would do the occasional tough interview with, some Democratic senator or whatever. And so he does this whole editorial on his show. I think it was the 10 days or so after the invasion, where he basically denounces every president that had been in office under Putin prior to Biden. So he denounces Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump, all for, according to Tapper, coddling, excusing, or justifying Putin's rise to tyrannical power in a way that, thank God, Biden was finally now putting an end to. So this really wasn't a part of, people might say that this is just Jake Tapper showing his true colors as some sort of Democratic partisan who loves Joe Biden. I don't think that's quite it. I think, the reason why we get so many of these frenzies or so-called state of emergencies during foreign policy crises and claimed crises, and the Afghanistan withdrawal last year was another example of it, I think, although not quite as intense, is because it sort of emanates out of this ideology around the national security state and American hegemonic primacy that really is sort of the animating value for a lot of these more, quote, establishment journalists who, if they were just outright unabashed partisans on every issue, like if Jake Tapper was just campaigning for Democrats, that wouldn't be in his career interests, right? That means that he wouldn't get Republicans on his show and he could just be dismissed more easily. But it's just as much in his career interest to be this kind of fulsome propagator of this ideology around American sort of hegemony. And even if that requires somehow denouncing George Bush as an appeaser of Putin, And also Obama and Bill Clinton and forget Trump. Of course, Trump will be denounced for this. But to also denounce Trump's three predecessors for that, I thought was sort of a very telling moment in terms of the ideological fervor that's developed around this issue. I think you're right to characterize us being in this state of never-ending emergency. I've called it permanent emergency. And actually, during COVID, one of the things that I covered for Substack, naturally, and you can subscribe to read this. Actually, I think it's free. Whatever, just enter your dopey little email address in the box, and you can get it. Was that there was actually a huge array of regulations and laws and executive decrees put in place that reflected and enshrined the state of permanent emergency, even almost 2 years on. I haven't covered the issue as much recently because of Ukraine, but this was in December of last year. You would go and look at these sort of county level decrees and places as various like Miami-Dade County, Florida, or Indiana, parts of California, everywhere, red states and blue states, really, mostly, disproportionate, I would say, blue states, but also there were patches of red states that did the same thing, where they would impose these unilateral sort of so-called emergency authorities, and they would be renewed basically indefinitely, regardless of the nature of the threat. So they actually enshrined and codified this concept of a permanent emergency that had been maybe germinated originally on social media and now is a feature of law. Like, for example, when these cities imposed vaccine passport schemes, in Boston, in definitely New York, Minneapolis, St. Paul, other places, the mayors didn't do this through any kind of deliberative process where the city council holds hearings and then they decide to pass a law and then it goes through a period of public comment or something. No, the mayors almost uniformly did it on a unilateral basis where they could just decree that the vaccine passport policy was going to be imposed, and henceforth it was imposed. And that was because they were still invoking the same powers that they had originally invoked in March of 2020 to now justify the implementation of measures that really had nothing to do with that initial so-called state of emergency around March of 2020 that I think most people at the time were willing to tolerate and found maybe defensible under the circumstances. They were using that same rationale almost 2 years later to put in stuff that they couldn't even really defensively articulate any epidemiological or medical rationale for. So when you're talking about a permanent state of emergency, it's not just a matter of people being in a constant uproar online. It actually manifests in terms of how the government operates. I sort of put the beginnings of this, at least in terms of the current era of permanent emergency, in 2016. I think there was a very striking sort of epistemic shift in 2016, definitely amongst the U.S. media and political class, where the purported stakes of an election were heightened to such a dramatic extent that it drove a ton of people crazy and actually caused a lot of the media to abolish the journalistic standards that they at least had previously claimed to abide by. Now, there are even prior to 2016, there were tons of problems with the media and pretending to be objective when they weren't, and was objectivity even a doctrine that we want to necessarily advocate journalists aspiring to, because it kind of entails just lying and pretending that everybody's the same or carries equal moral weight. So these debates had raged prior to 2016, but in 2016, they didn't even pretend any longer to be objective. And I think that also coincided with Twitter really being the engine of social media in general, but Twitter in particular amongst the media class, really being the engine driving this kind of sentiment, where it was taken as morally obligatory upon journalists to not just cover Trump, right, but to so-called defend democracy by standing up against Trump. So stand with democracy, stand against Trump. And now we're told to stand with Ukraine. And we had to stand with George Floyd, and we had to stand against COVID. And it's, these slogans kind of all congeal into the same sort of frenetic disposition that I really think came about in earnest in 2016. Maybe you can find different precursors to it before that, but I think there was this convergence of social media's influence reaching a tipping point at least in terms of how it dictated the priorities of the media. And Trump actually himself was part of this by making Twitter his primary communications platform. And also this kind of apocalyptic proclamation that there were like these dire existential stakes in 2016. And then when the fascistic menace, or the new Hitler actually wins, well, I mean, if you had taken this seriously, the rhetoric during the 2016 campaign, that really was a world historic calamity in that, Trump was either going to impose a network of concentration camps. Actually, remember AOC thought she found a concentration camp at one point, or he was going to blow up the world in a nuclear annihilation. Ironically enough, we seem to be much closer now to nuclear annihilation than we ever were under Trump. Or he was going to, I don't know, mass murder all Hispanics and whatever the supposed fear was. That seemed to have come to fruition. And, then you have this whole issue of, are all Trump supporters racists? And are they sort of morally culpable for what now Trump does? That there's a similar sort of logic at play when you see people kind of contemplating what to do with Russian society now because they're supporting Putin and Putin's approval ratings actually increased. Like another so-called fellow at that think tank that I mentioned earlier, the European Policy, whatever think tank, was musing recently about punishment not only needing to be doled out against Putin and his government, but against Russian society itself, because there's sort of some innate kind of viciousness or cynicism or some kind of toxic stew of negative qualities in the actual kind of Russian psyche that needs to somehow be extirpated. And there was like a comparable dynamic here with Trump supporters in the U.S. And that even took on a more kind of fevered valence after January 6th, where not only did supporters of Trump enable the accession of this, unprecedented fascist menace who is collapsing democracy and destroying the entire liberal international order or whatever, but they're also insurrectionists. I mean, they're also acquiescing to literal insurrection to overthrow the government. That's what it was called, right? I mean, it wasn't that, but that's what it was called. And now they have this kind of weapon in their arsenal in perpetuity for as long as Trump is around and kind of toying with the idea of running for president. Maybe he will, maybe he won't. But as long as that threat can be pointed to, then they're going to be able to gin up that same kind of aura of emergency that they sort of went out to dinner on, ate out on, I guess is the phrase, from 2016 to 2020. Regardless of whatever happens with some kind of COVID thing or Ukraine, I think that the underlying Trump dynamic really was a turning point and that I kind of put down to this transformation that 2016 occasioned, because there's always been war. I mean, there was a war in Putin, Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, and there was a coup and such, and it was not, I don't think obviously didn't reach the scale of fighting that we see now, but it was a significant world event, right? And people were following it. But I do think that there's like Trump sort of permanently unhinged something in the collective psyche of the elite media and political class that, it's like it opened a can of worms that can never be put back in. And I think that's actually part of the reason why the reaction to Putin himself is so insane, and why anybody who maybe has a more realist or a more circumspect opinion or perspective on the situation now is automatically going to be castigated. Because, and I wrote about this for Substack as well, sorry to constantly plug my Substack, but don't hate the player, hate the game. Mm-hmm. I wrote about this recently, right after the war was launched, which is that, there was this interesting phenomenon where if you look at what the top government officials in the Biden administration were saying in the run up to the war, so in particular, Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State. He was repeatedly asked, look, you're saying a war is imminent. What are you willing to do diplomatically to avert that potentiality that you're saying is almost a sure thing? Like, they didn't even say there was any doubt about this war coming up. And he was asked, are you willing to put on the table this idea of NATO not accepting Ukraine as a member? I mean, they had indicated that, Ukraine entering NATO was not like a realistic possibility anytime soon, but they weren't willing to relinquish the principle that NATO could accept Ukraine as a member. And that was exactly one of the grievances cited by Putin, because he had actually evidence on his side showing that there was this attempt to increasingly integrate Ukraine into NATO. It wasn't hidden. NATO elevated Ukraine into this enhanced partner status just in 2020, under Trump, by the way. So, I mean, as he was colluding with Putin, he was, at least tacitly supporting this NATO integration with Ukraine, with the Ukrainian military, which was like a red line that Putin said can never be crossed, and it was being repeatedly crossed.
Yeah.
But Blinken ruled out that possibility, right? Ruled out any diplomatic concession. And what is the reason why I think he did that, or one plausible reason? Well, it's because from 2016 to 2020, Putin was elevated as not just a bad guy on the world stage, right? But this, what Hillary Clinton called this grand godfather of global right-wing extremism. And one of the fruits of this reign of terror that Putin supposedly was on was that he installed Trump into the White House. Like, he collusively was able to engineer this Manchurian candidate scheme to put Trump in power and then be the puppet master. I mean, people were actually claiming, and I'm sure you recall,
$100,000 in Facebook ads did it.
Well, yeah, but people actually believed that Russia had subverted the U.S. government. Like, it wasn't just that, there might have been some light coordination amongst some of Trump's underlings and, troll farms in St. Petersburg or something. No, they were claiming that Putin was in control of the U.S. government. I mean, that's kind of it was like a wilder espionage thriller than I think ever had been produced in the 50s or 60s, right? It exceeded any of the most kind of far-fetched Cold War plots. That was genuinely believed. So how, and that belief was largely concentrated among Democrats. So once a new Democratic administration gets in power, they're going to have a heavy lift to justify why they're making any concessions at all to this person who's been imbued with such ideological characteristics and who is blamed still for subverting the U.S. election in 2016 to put in the worst person who's ever taken power in the country's history. I mean, that's the mainline view among the Democratic Party. So it's not surprising that they were unwilling to make any concessions at all, even if it's to avert a war. And now they seem to want to prolong the war. So they're continuing that whole theory as to what the proper role of the U.S. should be, which is now to undermine any diplomatic or negotiated resolution and to funnel more and more weapons into the war zone, bolstering the profit margins of weapons contractors, and eventually facilitating regime change in Russia. I mean, Biden blurted that out explicitly in his speech in Warsaw 10 days ago, and then they tried to walk it back and say, he didn't really mean that. Well, I mean, he reiterated that he meant it. He didn't deny that his intent is to see to it that Putin is removed from office. That's regime change. And even just yesterday, when Biden's demanding that Putin be put on trial for war crimes, well, in order to put him on trial for war crimes, you'd have to remove him from office first. So that's the policy of the U.S. I mean, it's clear. And I guess I've been going on too long now. Sorry to rant.
No. I think this is all super relevant stuff. I think the major question that comes out of all of this for me, like all the last 5, even 10 years, is what exactly is democracy? How does it work under the current system of information exchange? Because essentially, the idea behind democracy is that you have a informed populace who they make decisions based on the best available information, and the press helps them to do this. I mean, what we're seeing right now, all the claims about, subversion of our democracy, of, what exactly the outcomes have to be. And if they're not those outcomes, it's not really democratic. Like even the actual definition of democracy has shifted very much from the people decide what's going to happen. So when you have this type of information landscape where information is not just entertainment, it's gamified, it's something that we're absorbed in every day. Like politics is a pastime. Can you even speak of democracy? Like it really is ruled by media, and whenever the media doesn't get its way, it's an undemocratic or illiberal outcome. I mean, how long can this go on for? This is not a stable equilibrium, and I think the eternal hysteria ties into that. They need that to fuel the fire.
Yeah, I gotta go back and forth on this because maybe around 6 months ago, I had one of my occasional rabbit hole adventures where I returned to the JFK assassination. And if you look at, there was a really interesting contemporaneous article in the New Yorker from, I think it was the late 60s. It was after the Warren Commission, maybe 67, 68. And it was an article on all these gadfly characters around the US that, obviously pre-internet, had figured out a way to organize amongst themselves and do amateur investigation into the JFK assassination because they thought that the official investigation was flawed for whatever reason. And a lot of them came up with, real information. And a lot of these were very prestigious people, like, engineers and professors, if memory serves, mathematicians. So like not people to sniff at, right? And on the one hand, yeah, investigating the nature of the assassination of a president is just a straightforwardly worthwhile thing to do, just to solidify, if you can, the historical record. And it was still very much a live issue in the 60s. So you can't begrudge anyone for having an interest in it. At the same time, I think there was an aspect of gamification as well, where it became a pastime, right? It became something that gave them meaning. It became something that they could just delve into and engross themselves in and sort of enter into this sort of netherworld where their entire being is kind of dictated by their ability to ferret out the truth about JFK's assassination. I think there are other analogs to that throughout history that don't really have much to do with the internet per se, or even the current era. I think the internet now obviously makes it much easier to do so. And I think it's made that whole kind of predilection a lot more widespread. Actually, Russiagate was a great example of that because the contours of what Russiagate was were always expanding. Like there was never a core allegation, really. It was just always like this insinuation that something was off about Trump's relationship with Russia, and it was up to us, these protectors of democracy and responsible citizens, to discover the truth. And so you would see these endless array of rabbit holes opening up where, court documents would be sifted through and people would claim that they discovered something about one of Trump's properties in West Palm Beach, and flight logs would be sifted through, and on and on and on. It was this kind of open-ended, almost first-person, self-directed adventure that clearly a lot of people got meaning from because they thought they were doing something noble. They thought that this was necessary to resist this unparalleled menace. So I don't know. I don't know that like the fate of liberal democracy necessarily hinges on the existence of this sort of gamified interest. In politics, there's an interesting paper that I read a couple years ago by Eitan Hirsch, who I'm pretty sure is a professor at Tufts, about political hobbyism, which is actually very interesting. And I was prompted to look at this paper because I was developing this sense of like Russiagate fanaticism as really a function of hobbyism, meaning that it was something that really filled the day of people who otherwise had no ability to get meaning, and were deriving meaning from this. And even hobby is kind of even, I think, downplays the significance of it in their minds. It's not like, collecting stamps has like existential stakes, right? It transcended hobbyism, but hobbyism was really defined more like as an engagement in politics that's divorced from one's own material standing. Like, so you're engaging in politics not to accrue additional resources to yourself or to prevent other groups from acquiring resources at your expense. You're engaged in politics as a matter of kind of ideological inclination, right? Or to have something to do, or as an activity. And to me, Russiagate was kind of a watershed event in that. I mean, you always have people who are interested in politics that's like on a principle level because you're worried about the environment or worried about whatever, historical preservation. I mean, this is not new, but the way that Russiagate kind of coalesced into this all-consuming narrative that allowed for such endless kind of exploration and self-directed adventure to me was sort of new. But I think you're right, though, that the sort of nostrums around democracy are becoming more and more farcical. Like we're told that one of the reasons why we're supposed to be so frenetically terrified by Trump was that he was going to bring down the Western order and destroy liberal democracy. And, clearly liberal democracy is not really the operating principle. That's just the pretext for these so-called liberal Democrats to justify their pursuit of power. And there was a funny example of this that I saw yesterday after Orban won in the re-election in Turkey.
Hungary.
This was, I think, in the either the New York Times or Wall Street Journal, but the quote is, in Brussels, the EU had been weighing whether to cut funding for Hungary, with European lawmakers arguing that Mr. Orban has used his majority in parliament to rewrite election laws, redraw voting districts, and permit mail-in ballots without identity verification from communities that favor him. Now, I always so the European Union was apparently contemplating some sort of penalization of Orban, despite his receiving a democratic mandate and winning re-election, because he modified voting laws in a way that they don't deem to be acceptable. Now, I didn't buy into a whole lot of the voter fraud or / election fraud theories in the 2020 election. I think a lot of them were overblown, and I looked into a lot of myself journalistically. I wrote about them for newspapers. Sometimes the claims just really didn't hold up to scrutiny. I don't deny that there were changes made to certain election administration law, and that could be reasonably debated about whether it's a prudent thing to do moving forward. But some of the theories that were postulated really just did not hold up, namely about how supposedly this giant election fraud effort was concentrated on like 3 cities and swing states. It was Milwaukee and Philadelphia and Atlanta. And then you didn't see the same kind of turnout for Biden in other cities that weren't in swing states, but you actually did when you delve into it. Okay, but that doesn't really matter. That's ancient history. The point is that the people who are proponents of election fraud theories cited the exact same grievances now that are being cited against Orban by the European Union, and yet they were denounced as undermining democracy. Right? They were saying that this was supposedly all part and parcel with their hell-bent desire to wage insurrection. So, I mean, clearly these platitudes around democracy are totally circumstantial, and it's not about democracy as such. It's about when can democracy be invoked as sort of like a coercive tactic to, for example, enshrine the power of the European Union or the Democratic Party or whomever. I think that's more and more obvious as time goes on. It should have been obvious a while ago, even in the UK and Brexit. I mean, I'm in the UK now. All these pontificators about the so-called sanctity of democracy spent, 2-3 years in the aftermath of Brexit trying to figure out ways to either block the result, kind of hinder it or otherwise not implement it. There was a bona fide movement within the Labor Party, and this was in part precipitated the downfall of Jeremy Corbyn, that he had to negotiate these factions within the Labor Party that were split among either begrudgingly accepting the result or going all out to overturn it. And I don't know, it seems like overturning a referendum result that was the most that saw the highest turnout of any public plebiscite, I think, in UK history. Just thinking that you have now reserve the right to overturn it or to just ignore it. I don't know how. I mean, maybe they do have convoluted rationalizations for how that still is honoring democracy, but they do. But I think the plain reading of it is that they're obviously willing to buck democracy when they perceive it as within their interest, and that we see that pattern repeat over and over. And hopefully that now is going to entrench people's skepticism about how cynically this whole rhetoric is used.
Yeah, I mean, they definitely do, and this is what the whole wave of NGOs and groups and things like that against misinformation and fact checking and all of this stuff. Because if democracy goes wrong and if people vote wrong, it means that they have the wrong information. Because there is, obviously the truth is on the side of the real democracy, our democracy. So that's why and you've written a really great article recently for this new controversial magazine, Compact.
I would never be involved with any kind of controversial enterprise. I don't know what you're talking about.
I mean, yeah, it's somewhere on the internet, and it is about Pierre Omidyar, the eBay founder and also funder of many an NGO with a very friendly title, Humans for Good Action, Executive Committee for Interesting Events or things like that. Very, very neutral sounding agency. I mean, I have the name here. It's the Advancement Project. Obviously, a good thing. The project.
Well, he funded his philanthropic outfit, Omidyar Network, which I think is he first gives money to. Is it the Democracy Project? I mean, and then these whole names these names are so like anodyne that you can't even keep them straight. But one of his outfits that distribute his philanthropic largesse gave a contribution to this nonprofit called the Advancement Project. And when I was first researching the article, I wanted to just get a sense of like how he's spending his money. Omidyar being the billionaire founder of eBay, whose wealth ballooned, I think, almost 50% during COVID. I have the actual figures in that article. Yeah. And what is he doing with that wealth? Well, in 2020. Mercifully, he had the option of spending a lot of it on these newfound racial justice / equity enterprises that sprouted up in the wake of the George Floyd incident. And a gigantic amount of money was poured into these projects in the U.S. between 2020 and 2021.
$24 billion, according to your article.
Yeah, well, that's a figure that Thomas Edsall, the New York Times, reported. So I didn't tabulate that myself. And he said kind of a philanthropy firm's analysis of the amount of money that had been dedicated to this cause. So yeah, I mean, that's a ton of money coming in a very short period of time. And guess what? Not a whole lot of that is probably going to be scrupulously audited for efficacy or to see where it went. It's this is sort of a tangential point, but when I was in Poland, there are advertisements everywhere, billboards, even at bars, there are little placemats. When you go to the ATM, there's screens that pop up to give money to Ukraine. And what does that mean exactly? Well, a lot of these are like officially designated aid groups that have finances that can be a tad opaque, and they seem to get a ton of money in a very short period of time, and that's always ripe for either, if not outright corruption, misallocation of funds, or the people who run the firms making a giant amount of money. I'm not alleging that anybody in particular is like siphoning off money in Poland from these aid dollars. I'm only just kind of laying out the principle that when you have such a huge amount of money kind of just emotionalistically thrown into a pot all of a sudden for some sort of cause, that has the very obvious potential to lend itself to misuse. And there's a very similar dynamic in the US post George Floyd, where all these corporations and foundations and private donors and anybody who had any net worth was all of a sudden in a panic, trying to figure out how they could demonstrate their fidelity to the cause, right? And that entailed writing huge checks to these various nonprofits that purported to be doing, racial justice or equity or whatever. So one, just and this contribution that I happened to focus on in the article that went from one of Omidyar's outfits to this advancement project was really a drop in the bucket. I mean, I wasn't focusing on it because of the scope of the contribution. I mean, I think it was just $150,000, but it was just sort of representative of how willy-nilly these philanthropic enterprises and foundation, Ford Foundation and John D. and Catherine MacArthur Foundation, all these foundations were just pouring money into these groups without seemingly that much due diligence as to what the money would be used for. So sure enough, Advancement Project gets money from Omidyar and is one of the pioneers of actually literally calling to defund the police. Not they were accused of having policy objectives that might be construed as suggesting that they wanted to fund the police. No, the executive director of this organization went on MSNBC in June 2020 and specifically clarified that what they're agitating toward is to abolish the police, defund the police. And she was asked about it specifically. You can go look it up. So this isn't made up. A lot of Democratic operatives now will say that, defund the police was never really what was being advocated for. Well, I went to a lot of those protests in 2020. All around the country. And when I would see somebody waving a defund the police sign, oftentimes I would ask them, like, what do they mean by that? And they would be clear that they wanted to actually, not just take away 15% of the police department's funding and send it to social services. No, they had an anarchistic or quasi-anarchistic, and I think it's I don't even begrudge them having this view. I think it's actually a somewhat coherent opinion about the nature of police force, especially in the US, where police are often way too aggressive and confrontational and intrusive. So I don't even begrudge them that. But for advocating that per se, maybe I wouldn't necessarily endorse the concept of eliminating all law enforcement writ large. Still, but I think it's like a coherent point of view that one could argue for. But what they then started doing was obfuscating that that's what they were arguing for. And so you have this nonprofit group getting money from one of the top philanthropic funders in the U.S., Omidyar, who's dedicating his life now to these progressive so-called causes, and that's explicitly what they were using. That's explicitly what they were advocating, right? Defunding the police. So it was just interesting because what they did simultaneously, this advancement project group, which is supposed to be nonpartisan, right? In the U.S., there's this whole legal framework around so-called 501c3s, where if you're a nonprofit, you can't engage in outright electioneering. You can't have an explicit partisan motive. So they had to say that they were not partisan. And this has sort of been a nonsensical, corrupt trend going back years, but it seemed to go into overdrive in 2020 because all these supposedly nonprofit organizations that were flushed suddenly with money were doing election-related work, and they just happened to decide to go to the swing states, and they just happened to distribute sort of briefing guides to their canvassers, suggesting questions they might put to prospective voters, such as, telling them that Black lives are literally on the line in this election, and that's why you need to make sure that you have a plan to vote. And, I don't think anybody really had to guess whether a person being told that Black lives are on the line if you don't vote is thinking that they're being suggested to vote for Donald Trump. So the partisan inclination there is not really hard to infer. But so anyway, they're basically helping get Biden elected, right? Which is, they're right. And they do this voter outreach or whatever in Georgia, Michigan, the key states. And a few months later, or a year, so Biden gets elected. A year and a half later, he just delivers his 2022 State of the Union speech. And what does he declare? Unflinchingly, I'm paraphrasing, but it's something to the effect of, the answer is not to defund the police, it's fund the police. Fund the police. So it seems like it came full circle, where you had this mania around this uncontrolled funds flowing into these groups to just do whatever kind of ideological pet projects they wanted to do. And then Democrats claim that they disavow them, or they didn't really believe what was being advocated for, in so far as the defund the police slogan or whatever. And it seemed to culminate with Biden, who this organization that Omidyar had funded worked to elect, essentially, eventually coming around in his most high profile address of the year, or one of them anyway, saying, look, no, we're not doing what these nonprofit guys had been in a haze thinking that we were going to do when they were receiving all your largesse in June of 2020. But yeah, I mean, so that was just sort of an amusing example of like the trajectory of these donations, right, that come out of the Omidyar network. But he justifies it all under the auspices of protecting democracy. I mean, I'm blanking on the name of the actual organization that funded it. If you have the article up, I think it's like the Democracy Project, Democracy something, Democracy to Fund, Democracy Fund, right? So it's all like with the conceit that it's just about merely nonpartisanly and innocuously defending democracy. And you can and it kind of gets back to the point we were just making earlier. I mean, this is all just window dressing for a pre-existing sort of worldview that they're trying to make appear to be like mainstream and acceptable to the masses. And as you also alluded to, one of the things that Omidyar became very interested in post 2016, when I think he was also one of the affected by this sort of epistemic rupture around 2016, because although he had had a philanthropic outfit before that, it wasn't quite as sort of like alarmist in what causes he was saying needed to be funded. Like it didn't pitch its activities as having these existential stakes, right, or needing to defend democracy. It was just kind of your standard fare, sort of vaguely progressive, whatever expenditures. But ever since 2016, Omidyar started. He donated to the original Never Trump PAC before Never Trump was even really a thing. I mean, it became a thing in part because people were saying they were Never Trump on Twitter, but then it also became a PAC that some of these former Republican operatives were running. And sure enough, Omidyar gives money to that. I think it was a six-figure contribution to, again, a drop in the bucket in terms of his overall wealth. But nonetheless, something substantial. And then all of a sudden, by sheer coincidence, Omidyar subsequently becomes very interested in the scourge of disinformation on the internet. Because he just has this principled worry that people are going to be misled by what they view online. So it's not just, he's not worried merely that they're going to consume this wrong information and then vote for a bad presidential candidate. No, he's just genuinely concerned about their kind of intellectual health, right? So he funds all these disinformation initiatives or anti-disinformation initiatives. And again, it's one of these tricks that, if you're an ordinary person, even if you're, most liberals are, I think, you can have reasonable conversations with them, and they're going to think that disinformation probably is a problem, because if you're on the internet, you see a lot of crazy stuff, right? And so, on paper, they might not think that there's anything particularly nefarious about initiatives to combat disinformation. But what they don't do, because their lives are busy and they have families or jobs or whatever, is they don't dig into any of the details about what actually disinformation supposedly is. And what it is, and what is blaringly obvious once you just evaluate any of these organizations. Like Omidyar gave money in the name of anti-disinformation efforts to like the Brookings Institution, the Atlantic Council. I mean, these are the main kind of interventionist organs of think tankery in DC. And so there's this whole kind of bundle of ideological presuppositions underlying their supposed sincere concern for combating misinformation that have nothing to do with disinformation per se. Because, of course, they're always willing to countenance the proliferation of different kinds of disinformation that doesn't pose any political problem to them. Russiagate itself, where you saw this flourishment of disinformation outfits, because Russian trolls on Twitter and Facebook were such this all-consuming menace. Constantly, there would have to be stuff that would be retracted, or oftentimes journalists didn't even bother retracting them. Like there was this, infamously, there was this story that The Guardian published, like Luke Harding, 2018, where he claimed that Manafort, Paul Manafort, Trump's one-time campaign chair, who then went to prison on as a result of the Mueller investigation, but on grounds that had nothing to do with any kind of collusion with Russia. They just basically got him on tax avoidance and not registering for under the FARA Act to basically legitimize his lobbying efforts. But The Guardian ran this piece where they're claiming that Julian Assange in the embassy in London had this secret meeting, the Ecuadorian embassy in London had this secret meeting with Manafort in 2016 where they were applauding their collusion. And, this article has now been up for years. It's been consistently undercut as having any plausibility. And, none of basically it's fake. I mean, you can be 99% sure at this point. Otherwise, they would have probably got around to corroborating it. And yet none of these supposed anti-disinformation outfits that are funded by Omidyar and all these other foundations that are so, keen on ensuring that the internet is free of disinformation, none of them would classify that as disinformation. Why? Because, it's one of these, respectable liberal outfits putting forward this information, and they're sort of constitutionally incapable of propagating disinformation. It's just not within their DNA, right? So would never accuse them of it. So again, it's just it's all a pretext really to advance their worldview and their political interests, and they keep kind of groping for these different new slogans and ideological conceits that enable them to do that with more and more efficacy, whether it's democracy or anti-disinformation or whatever. And none of it. It's not even worth trying to discern any consistent through line in their stated principles, because the principle is just their own power. And once you recognize that, then it becomes more comprehensible.
Yeah, and just the existence of all these NGOs nationally is one thing, but then internationally, like the power that these NGOs have in different markets, like U.S. NGOs or European NGOs, like even in Eastern Europe, is immense. Like the color revolution phenomenon, mainly funneled through NGOs, which are in turn funded by different layers, like the layers of the onions, which end up getting funding from the State Department and things like that. But that's another huge rabbit hole that maybe we can discuss the next time you come on.
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe next time we can discuss how so much of the information that comes out of Ukraine and that is then dutifully amplified in U.S. media in particular really originates from these NGO-funded, quasi-journalistic outfits that are supposedly independent and fierce and bold and adversarial, but are kind of just prongs of this whole government / nonprofit complex that obviously devotes its resources for a very specific purpose. And it's why, all these newfound journalists have this exact same line as the State Department or as the Pentagon in Ukraine, and therefore deserve to be, celebrated as these bold heroes bringing us the truth. And I could go through many examples of this, but there are almost too many to name. But the average CNN viewer, has no idea, for example, that just pulling it up now because this one is amazing. Anyway, there's this outfit called the I want to make sure I have it. See, this is why I should prepare for interviews so I can actually reference stuff. OCCRP, organized crime and corruption reporting project. So this is not even really like an NGO so much as this new media outfit that was formed explicitly with a majority funding from the U.S. government, including the State Department and USAID. And I got into a little tussle with some of these people because they were attacking me as they're wont to do. And I didn't even know at the time that they ran this journalistic outfit that is State Department, basically a proxy of the State Department. And I looked into it. And I said, okay, so you're calling me a shill or something reminiscent of that. What's the reason why the State Department gives you millions of dollars per year to do your bold journalism? Oh, and I was told by this guy, his name is Ilya Lazovsky, and he specifically said, here's his direct quote: "It's U.S. government policy to support independent journalism." So he thought he was getting these millions of dollars a year from the State Department for totally altruistic purposes, just so he can tell the truth about what's going on in the world. And these guys are, very involved in covering Ukraine right now. And there's this whole other sprawling network of these newfound journalists. It's like this Kyiv Independent. It's this outfit that didn't exist until a couple of months ago, and now is the number one source of all things Ukraine in the English language as far as Western media is concerned. And it was basically started with an emergency grant from this, philanthropic wing of the European Union. And obviously the European Union has certain priorities as to what kind of governance is going to come out of the situation in Ukraine. So yeah, there's almost no one, very few people are at all actually independent who are covering the Ukraine situation. It's all filtered through this lens of the NGO / outright governmental subsidy network that most people consuming this news have no ability to really probe, and so therefore just take everything at face value, which is why, hopefully what I try to do on a daily basis, in addition to fighting with people online, is give them greater resources to utilize their own abilities of discernment.
Yes. And we thank you, Michael. And that's why you should head to the mtracy.substack.com, become a subscriber, and also read Michael's work in other outlets, some which shall not be named. Before I let you go, I want to ask
you can name them, it's fine. Maybe they're ashamed of their affiliation with me at this point.
No. I think there's a lot of controversy around this new magazine, the right. Post-liberal vibes trying to propagate around the world.
Very dangerous.
Very, very dangerous. I want to ask you the question of the show. Everyone gets asked this question. Do you have a subversive thinker, writer, journalist, someone who's been influential in your thinking that you think is underrated, that people should read more of, should be more interested in?
I think people should read more I.F. Stone. I.F. Stone had a Substack before there was Substack. He actually had a newsletter that he published out of his apartment in Washington, D.C. Decades ago, and he churned out all giant volume of original reporting and analysis, and was part of his whole philosophy was not being beholden to any vested interest in DC, despite having a huge array of sources. So I think it's not that I can necessarily give you one key insight necessarily he gave, and so as much as he sort of embodied, I think, a style or a temperament of journalism that really is sorely needed now. And I'm not, trying to puff myself up as like the second coming of I.F. Stone or whatever, but I think, there's a reason why these new channels of funding, such as Substack and such as other arrangements, are worthwhile. It's not just because you are able to generate income and do stuff that people appreciate. It's because it actually vests you with the ability to be steadfastly independent. And hopefully that instills confidence in your readership. And I know I.F. Stone, I don't know, he did have a lot of subversive thoughts about, that was a time when he was covering basically the construction of what we think of today as the military industrial complex. Like there was the post-World War II era where all those interests were being kind of entrenched as a permanent feature of the Washington, D.C. kind of governance apparatus and its connections also to the corporate world. So he was a very early chronicler of that. And I think the dynamic today is very much akin to it. People at least purport to be familiar with the malign influence of the military-industrial complex, and then they'll turn around and give unbridled support to a proxy war waged by the U.S. that has as its central feature the direct provision of arms by these military-industrial complex actors. So yeah, it's just as relevant, I think, today, and in particular, how the self-perpetuating interests of these factions are given this ideological sheen and are justified with different slogans about standing with this or that. Now it's Ukraine, we're waving a flag or whatever, but it could easily just as easily be some other geopolitical hotspot a year from now. And I'm not one of these people who thinks that everything is reducible to sheer profit interest. There's often also interwoven with that certain ideological commitments. But the profit motive is sorely underrepresented in sort of popular media depictions of what's going on with U.S. foreign policy. I just gave you a couple of examples of these think tank people who are directly funded by the arms industry, directly funded by in some cases the U.S. military, and then they're presented as neutral experts to write columns on CNN.com or give their commentary on NBC or whatever. So yeah, I think I.F. Stone gives a real window into the origins of some of these dynamics now that I think are very much still relevant.
Thank you so much, Michael. That's useful. I wasn't aware of I.F. Stone, but I'll check him out. And is there another place that people should go to find you to see your work?
Twitter and Substack, I think, is about it. I have if you're interested, I do call-in shows on this app Call-in, which is now available on Android, I'm told, either once or twice a week. And I have a YouTube channel. I have a channel on this platform called Rockfin. But all that's, you can pretty much just get by looking at my Twitter, and I provide links to access the whole breadth of my output. So you can 24/7 you can consume my
if
content
you spell
really
Michael's name right with an E.
Yeah, if you spell it wrong, then I totally disavow you.
Thanks again, Michael. This was really enjoyable.
All right, thanks. Yeah, I enjoyed it.